Story 1. My name is Colonel Priya Mehta, retired. 23 years in the Indian Army Signals Corps teaches you two things above everything else. First, verify before you trust. Second, when something feels wrong in your equipment, it is wrong. You do not rationalize. You do not hope. You shut it down and you find the fault. I apply that same framework to everything in my life now. I need you to understand that before I tell you what happened on the Nayar River in August of 2019, because what I'm about to describe is not a ghost story. I don't believe in ghost stories. I believe in data. I believe in logs. I believe in the recordings I keep of everything, a habit so deep it survived retirement, survived my husband leaving, and survived even the death of my son Arjun 3 years before that night. Arjun was 22 when the truck hit his motorcycle on NH58. I identified him from his signals cadet ring because the face was not identifiable. I wrote that in my personal log that night. Precise, factual. That is how I survive things. I have been fishing the Nayar for 4 seasons. Remote water, 2 hours from Poweri, is accessible by a dirt track that my Bolero barely managed each time. The kind of water that rewards the person willing to earn it. Mossier country. Cold, even in August, fed by snowmelt channels that had no interest in the season below them. I had told my sister I would be back by Sunday evening. She knows me well enough to know that means exactly Sunday evening, not Sunday-ish. I parked at the flat boulder I always used as a marker, noted the time 10:37 p.m. in my log, attached my headlamp, and hiked the 15 minutes down to the stretch I preferred, a bend where a side channel fed cold water into the main flow, and the mossy here held in the seam between temperatures. I had my rod, my vest, my knife, and my personal recorder running in the left chest pocket as always. The recorder is always running. Old habit. The first hour was clean. Good water, good sound, and the river doing exactly what rivers do, at night louder than daylight, more present, and filling the dark with itself. I was working a run about 30 meters from the main bend when the river changed. I want to be precise about this, because precision matters here. The current did not stop. It paused. A 10-foot section directly in front of me flattened. Not the whole river, just that section. The way a held breath is not the same as stopped breathing. And with it, the sound dropped. Not gradually, immediately. The river's baseline frequency that you stop hearing after 30 minutes of standing in it at simply was not there anymore. No insects. No drip from the overhanging branches. No movement in the tall grass on the opposite bank. Then I heard Arjun say my name. The register was his. The vowel was exactly his, that specific way he had of stretching the middle of the word when he was tired or content. I know that sound the way I know my own heartbeat. 22 years of that sound. But the consonants were wrong. The M at the beginning was too soft. Approximated. Like something had accessed a recording of my son's voice and was playing it back through equipment that did not fully understand what it was reproducing. It came from the opposite bank, from the tall grass above the water line, where the bank rose steeply into dense riverine forest. I am not a woman who panics. I stood in the water with my rod at my side, and I said clearly, in the voice I used to use for junior officers who needed correction, "Identify yourself." The river sound came back. The current resumed. A fish moved somewhere upstream. I stood there and breathed for 2 minutes. I counted them. Then it came again. "Ma, Yahana, come here." Arjun never spoke to me in Hindi. Not once in his life. We spoke in English at home. Always. He thought it was funny. A family joke. His friends teasing him about his mother, the colonel, who refused to speak anything else at the dinner table. Whatever was on that bank had access to his voice. It did not have access to how he used language. That wrongness, that specific, small, utterly critical wrongness is what kept me standing in the river instead of walking toward the grass, because I wanted to walk toward it. I want to be honest about that. Some part of my nervous system that exists below rank and training and 23 years of operational discipline heard that voice and wanted to go toward it. And the only thing that stopped me was the grammar being wrong. Then the grass moved, not wind. There was no wind. The movement started at the far right edge of the bank grass and progressed left. Slow, deliberate, each stem bending in sequence, heel to toe. If you put those words on grass instead of footprints, something was moving through that grass, parallel to the bank, moving slowly. not parting the stems carelessly the way an animal does, but stepping through them with a weight and patience that suggested it was choosing where to place each movement. I moved to the center of the river. Deeper water, worse footing, better sight lines to both banks. "I can hear you," I said. Same voice, same register. "I am leaving this water now." The grass stopped. I did not run. Running is a decision, and I was not prepared to make that decision because of what it meant. That I was confirming, officially, in the part of my brain that keeps the real logs, that there was something to run from. I broke my rod down without rushing. I packed my vest. I turned on my headlamp, and I began walking upstream toward my exit point, keeping the opposite bank in my peripheral vision. The grass moved with me, not continuously, in intervals. I walked, it was still. I stopped, it was still. I walked again, and after 3 steps, it moved, matching my progress upstream, staying level with me on the opposite bank, never crossing the water. I reached the shallows where the side channel met the main river, the open stretch above the bend. The grass on the opposite bank stopped at the edge of the dense section. Whatever was in it did not follow me into the open water. I hiked out. 15 minutes to the bolero. I started the engine, and I sat there with the headlights pointing at the dirt track, and I did not move for 4 minutes. When I got to Powery, I drove to my sister's house. I did not tell her what happened. I told her the fishing had been poor. She made tea, and I sat at her kitchen table and I opened my recorder and I found the time stamp and I listened. The river sound, the pause, the silence, and then Arjun's voice saying my name. And then after a gap of perhaps 2 seconds, a sound I had not heard while standing in that river. A low sound, rhythmic, patient, like breathing, but too slow, too deep, coming from somewhere close to the recorder on the opposite bank. And then, very quietly, in something that was almost a voice but processed through the wrong instrument, one more sound, 2 syllables. Not Arjun's voice this time, something else using its own voice. Finally, perhaps because it understood I was already leaving. I have listened to that recording 47 times. I have enhanced the audio twice. I know what those 2 syllables sound like, and I have not written them in this account because writing them feels like an acknowledgement I am not prepared to make official. My recorder is in my desk drawer at home. The file is labeled with the date and the location and nothing else. I have not been back to the Nayar at night. I still fish. I still keep my recorder running. I still verify before I trust, and I still shut down any equipment that produces a fault I cannot identify. I have just, quietly, without announcing it to anyone, added 1 item to my pre-departure checklist for every night session on mountain water. I verify that the voice I'm hearing knows the language. If you spend time near mountain rivers in remote water at night, always tell someone your exact location and return time. If you hear something that sounds familiar but feels wrong, trust the wrongness. Your nervous system is older than your reasoning and it knows the difference. Leave. Document everything. You are not imagining it. Story 2. I don't do fear. I want to be clear about that before I tell you what happened on the upper trail of Margalla Hills. In December of 2021, 30 years of field work teaches you to replace fear with observation. Fear is noise. Observation is data. When you are tracking a leopard through fresh snow at 3 a.m. in the northern mountains, fear is the thing that gets you killed. Observation is the thing that gets you home. My name is Dr. Richard Calloway, retired now, but for 3 decades I was a senior field biologist with the National Wildlife Federation. I have tracked snow leopards in the Himalayas. I have documented brown bears across 4 continents. I have spent more nights alone in the wilderness than most people spend sleeping in their own beds. I know what is out there. I know what it sounds like. I know what it sounds like. I thought I knew. December 14th. Pre-dawn survey, standard protocol. I had been mapping small mammal movement patterns in the upper forest sectors for 6 weeks, the sections beyond the marked tourist trails where the real wilderness begins. My equipment was what it always is: field notebook, GPS unit, voice recorder running in my left breast pocket, camera with night lens, and field tape for measurements. I told my wife Margaret I would be back by 9 a.m. She knows that means 9 a.m. exactly, not 9-ish, not roughly 9. 9. I parked at the sector access point at 4015 and started up the trail at 4022. The temperature was 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Frost on every surface. My headlamp put a clean white cone through the pine trees, and the forest was doing what dark forests do at that hour, existing in its own frequency, completely indifferent to the person moving through it. The first 40 minutes were completely clean. Then I came around the bend, above the second switchback, and I stopped walking. In the clearing where the trail widened, where 3 pine trees had fallen years ago and left an open patch of frost-covered ground, there was a circle. I use that word precisely because it is the correct word. A circle approximately 9 feet in diameter, composed of wild mountain berries, the small dark red ones that grow on shrubs along the upper trail. Each berry had been placed stem up. I know this because I walked the entire perimeter and examined every single placement before I touched anything. Stem up. Every single one. Placed deliberately, not dropped. The spacing between each berry was consistent enough that I pulled out my field tape and measured 3 separate intervals before I was willing to accept what I was seeing. 14 inches. 14 inches. 14 inches. 14 inches. In 30 years of wildlife tracking, I have documented the food caching behavior of mountain lions, the object arrangement patterns of certain corvids, and the deliberate placement behaviors of black bears. I have never, not once, seen any known North American species arrange food objects in a geometrically perfect circle with measured equal spacing at pre-dawn in freezing temperatures. I photographed the circle from 4 angles. I noted the time, 5:03 a.m., in my field notebook. Then I looked inside the circle. The frost-covered grass in the center had been pressed completely flat, not randomly, not the way an animal rolls or drops, pressed in the distinct shape of something that had been lying there deliberately. I pulled out my field tape again because that is what I do. I measure things. I do not interpret them until I have the numbers. The shoulder width of the impression measured 34 inches across. I measured it twice. The largest recorded human shoulder width is 28 inches. I placed my hand 2 inches above the pressed grass without touching it. The impression was still radiating heat. Whatever had been lying in that circle had been there within the last 20 minutes, possibly less. I stood up slowly and looked at the tree line surrounding the clearing. Nothing moved. I went back to my notebook and began sketching the layout: circle diameter, berry spacing, impression dimensions, and compass orientation. Standard documentation. The same thing I would do if I found unusual leopard scat or an unexpected den site. Data first, everything else after. That is when the breathing started. And I need you to understand something before I describe it. I have recorded the breathing of every large mammal that exists in wilderness environments. I have sat 6 feet from a sedated grizzly and listened to its respiratory pattern. I have documented the specific wet exhale of black bears in late autumn. I know breathing. I catalog breathing. Breathing is data. What I heard was not in my catalog. It was slow, significantly slower than any large mammal respiratory rate I have on record. Each inhale was almost inaudible, a long, controlled draw. But the exhale was wet at the very end. Not consistently wet throughout, just at the final moment of each breath, like something being filtered through material that shouldn't be there. And it was coming from above me, not from the tree line, not from the ground. From above me, I raised my headlamp slowly. The pine branches overhead were dense and black against the pre-dawn sky. My light reached approximately 25 feet into the canopy. I could see nothing that I could define. But the branches in the third pine, the one directly above the circle, were moving in a pattern that had nothing to do with wind. There was no wind. The movement was a slow, rhythmic compression and release. Something up there was breathing, and the branches were moving with it. I said clearly, in my field documentation voice, that I was a wildlife researcher conducting a survey, and that I could hear movement in the canopy above me. The breathing stopped. The branches went still. I waited 4 minutes. I counted them in my head, the way I count everything. Then I continued down the trail toward my secondary survey point, keeping the clearing in my peripheral vision for as long as the trail allowed. At my secondary point, the flat granite boulder where I always stopped to rest and reorganize my pack, I found the second circle, smaller, 5 feet in diameter, the same wild berries, the same stem-up placement, the same 14-inch spacing, centered perfectly on the flat surface of the boulder. I have been stopping at that boulder on this trail for 6 weeks. It is not visible from the main trail junction. You cannot see it until you are within 20 feet of it. Whatever built that circle had watched me stop there before and remembered it. Not once. Enough times to be certain. I stood at the boulder for a long time without moving. I had installed it on a pine trunk 15 feet from the boulder 3 weeks earlier, angled to capture the boulder and the trail approach. Standard monitoring setup. The camera was still on its mount, but it had been rotated 90 degrees to face the uphill slope instead of the trail. The rotation required pressing a specific release button on the mount bracket and physically repositioning the housing. It is not a 2-second operation. Whoever repositioned it knew exactly what they were doing and took the time to do it carefully. I pulled the SD card right there. I would review it properly at home, but I wanted the timestamp data immediately. The last recorded motion event before my camera was repositioned was at 2:17 a.m. on the previous Tuesday, 4 seconds of footage. Then the card showed nothing until my own arrival that morning. I did not review those 4 seconds on the trail. I put the card in my vest pocket and I packed up my notebook, and I started walking back toward my vehicle at a pace I will describe as efficient. Not running. I do not run from data, but I was not taking my time. On the way back, I passed the main clearing. I stopped at the edge and raised my headlamp into the third pine one more time. The branches where the breathing had been were broken. Not snapped violently, broken in a descending sequence. The highest break first, then lower again. Something had come down from that canopy. The breaks were fresh. The sap on the exposed wood was still wet and running slowly in the cold air. It had been up there long before I arrived. It had come down after I left. I reached my vehicle at 6:48 a.m. I sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine, and I reviewed my voice recorder from the beginning of the session. At the 23-minute mark, the period when I was sketching silently at the circle and believed the forest was completely quiet, the recorder picked up something I had not heard with my own ears. Knocking, slow and rhythmic, coming from the pine directly above the circle. 7 knocks. A long pause. 7 knocks again, perfectly spaced, perfectly even. The same interval between every knock, the way a metronome holds time. Not a branch settling, not thermal wood movement. 7 and 7 and silence. I have submitted a full written report to the Park Management Office with my GPS coordinates, field measurements, photographs, and the audio file. A wildlife officer called me 4 days later. He told me there had been reports in that sector going back 14 months. Unusual impressions, repositioned equipment, sounds from the upper canopy that did not match any cataloged species. He asked me if I wanted to go back with a team. I told him I would think about it. I am still thinking about it. The audio file is saved on 3 separate drives. I've listened to those 7 knocks 112 times. I've run them through acoustic analysis software. The interval between each knock is identical to 4 decimal places. Nothing that lives in those trees knocks with that kind of precision. Nothing I know about. If you hike remote trails before dawn, always file your exact route with someone reliable. If you find arranged objects in the wilderness circles, stacked stones, placed food, do not step inside them. Photograph everything, note the time, and leave immediately. Report to your local park or wildlife authority. Story 3. I have photographed 114 homicide scenes. I want you to sit with that number for a moment before I tell you what happened in Vermont in November of 2021. 114. In 28 years with the FBI field office, I documented everything. Staged suicides, disposal sites, the particular grammar of violence that human beings leave behind when they think no one is looking. I have knelt in farmhouse kitchens and crawl spaces and the trunks of abandoned vehicles, and I have raised my camera, and I have done my job without shaking. I do not say this to impress you. I say it so you understand the baseline. My name is Dr. Caroline Marsh, retired now. Landscape photography, clean air, no body bags. My husband Richard calls it my second life. He's not wrong. Every Saturday I drive out to somewhere rural, and I shoot until the light goes, and then I drive home, and I sleep without dreaming, which is a thing I could not do for most of my career. November 13th was a Saturday. I had been researching the Harwood timber property for 3 weeks, a 200-acre parcel in rural Vermont that had been in probate since 2017 with no active management. 19th century structures are still standing, the kind of location that landscape photographers find in old county records and mark on their maps with quiet excitement. I had written permission from the probate administrator. I had the GPS coordinates of the main structures. I had my full kit professional body, 3 lenses including the 400mm telephoto, 2 flashes, voice recorder, and field notebook. I parked at the collapsed logging road gate at 5:45 p.m. and hiked in. The ice house was my primary target. Built in 1887, stone walls 3 feet thick, partially collapsed on the south end, but the north end is completely intact, according to the County Historical Survey. I had been looking forward to this shoot for weeks. Pre-winter light, abandoned stone structure, and the texture of that kind of age. I was on the ridge above the property at 7:22 p.m. when I saw the light, amber, warm, emanating from the narrow doorway of the intact north end. I have spent 28 years learning to look at things carefully before I move toward them. It is a survival skill in my former profession, so I did not move. I raised the 400mm lens, and I looked at that doorway from 200 yards, and I thought carefully about what I was seeing. Not a flashlight, not a phone light, the specific warm yellow of an oil lamp or a kerosene source. The kind of light that has a breathing quality to it. A slight organic variation that electric light does not produce. Steady, but alive. Coming from somewhere inside the north end of a stone ice house that had no power infrastructure within 6 miles. I began shooting from the ridge. Continuous burst, frame after frame of that doorway. In frame 1, the light is present and the doorway is empty. In frame 2, taken exactly 3 seconds later, the doorway is empty, but the light is gone. Not dimmed, not flickered, gone. Between one frame and the next, in 3 seconds of a November night in Vermont, something extinguished a light source that should have taken 30 seconds to die. I stood on that ridge for 4 full minutes without moving. Then I went down. I am not a reckless person, but I am a person who has spent 3 decades moving toward things other people run from, and that instinct does not fully retire when you do. I approached at an angle, camera up, shooting continuously. At 40 yards, I called out. I identified myself as a photographer with written permission to be on the property. Silence. Complete and total. At 30 yards, I switched to my flash and began shooting the doorway directly. Dark interior, stone walls, the smell of cold and old wood, and something else I could not immediately identify, sweet in the way old dried herbs are sweet. Concentrated. In my third flash frame, the interior lit up for a fraction of a second, and on the far stone wall, I saw writing, not carved, written, dark against the pale granite, in letters large enough to read from 30 yards if I had been willing to stand there long enough to process them. I was not willing. Not that night. I lowered my camera, and I walked back to my vehicle at a pace I will call professional. Not running. I have never run from a scene in my life, and I was not about to start, but I did not linger. In the car, I reviewed my flash frames on the camera screen. The writing was there in frame 3, partially visible, partially obscured by the angle. I could make out shapes. I could not make out words. Not on that screen. Not at that size. I drove home. I told Richard I had a productive shoot. I did not tell him about the light. At my desk that night, I pulled the flash frames into my editing software, and I enlarged frame 3 to full resolution. The writing on the stone wall was my name, not Caroline Marsh, my full legal name, Caroline Ruth Marsh. The name on my birth certificate, on my sealed personnel file, and on documents I have not shown to a single living person outside of federal human resources in 30 years of government service. The name I have never published, never used professionally, and never attached to any public record, any social media account, any byline, or any credit anywhere in my life. Written in ash and something darker on the interior wall of an ice house that no one had authorization to enter. I went back the next morning, full daylight. Richard knew where I was going this time. I had given him the GPS coordinates and told him to call Vermont State Police if I was not home by noon. He did not ask questions. 26 years of marriage teaches a person when not to ask questions. The writing was still there. On the stone workbench along the north wall, there were objects arranged in a single, precise row. I documented them before I touched anything. 28 years of protocol do not negotiate. A bundle of dried herbs bound with white thread, a large crow feather positioned across the bundle, a glass jar containing layered soil sample, distinct geological strata from what appeared to be multiple different locations, and at the far end of the row, face down, a photograph. I stood at the workbench for a long time before I turned it over. It was one of mine. I recognized it immediately. My framing, my light setup, and my specific compositional habit of placing the primary subject in the left third of the frame. A crime scene photograph from a case I worked in 1998 in northern Vermont, a farmhouse kitchen in Lamawil County. A case that was never solved, never closed, never discussed publicly in any form. That photograph existed in exactly one location in the world, a sealed evidence archive in the Burlington FBI field office. Never digitized, never copied. Chain of custody intact and documented since 1998. I was holding a perfect duplicate of a sealed federal evidence photograph in an abandoned ice house in the Vermont woods. My hands did not shake. I want to be honest about that. They did not shake. But something happened behind my sternum that I have not been able to fully name since. A shift in the fundamental assumption I carry about how the world is organized and what is possible within it. I called my former supervisor from the parking area. He pulled the archive file that afternoon. The original photograph was there, sealed, undisturbed, chain of custody unbroken, last accessed in 2003 by a reviewing agent whose name I know. There is no explanation for the duplicate. There is no explanation for my middle name on that wall. There is no explanation for the light that died in under 1 second. When I reviewed the continuous shooting sequence from my approach that night, I found something I had not noticed in the field. In frames 31 through 38, shot between 25 and 20 yards from the doorway, my camera's autofocus system had locked onto something in that doorway and tracked it. I know this because the focus distance is embedded in every frame's metadata. In frame 31, the lock distance is 24, 3 yards. In frame 38, it is 31, 7 yards. Something was in that doorway, moving slowly backward into the ice house as I approached. My camera tracked it for 8 consecutive frames. My eyes saw nothing. Whatever was inside that ice house saw me coming from a long way off and chose to step back rather than step out. I still do landscape photography every Saturday. I no longer shoot abandoned structures after dark. I no longer need to. Never enter abandoned or remote structures alone at night, regardless of your experience or credentials. Always file your exact location with a trusted contact before solo shoots. If you see unexplained light in an uninhabited structure, photograph it from a distance. Never approach and report to local authorities immediately.